Our next session is AI and the Law, Democratising Access or Perpetuating Divide.
Great. Well, we have got a big topic to talk about next. I think we've heard throughout yesterday and this morning that AI is becoming increasingly pervasive. And one of the issues that goes alongside that is the fact that lawyers need to be standing next to issues around AI wherever they are happening, whether that is to work out how we can ensure that laws are functioning in the way that they need to stand next to human rights defenders that might be being affected by the pervasive movement of AI through systems and society. But we also need to think about how AI is transforming the legal profession as well. This is going to be a critical issue in the years ahead of us. And it is transforming the legal profession already. It's increasing speed, efficiency, automation, it's reducing manual tasks, and it's enhancing accessibility. But there's more to it than just this. As we heard this morning, ChatGPT-4 is already capable of passing the US bar exam, and it's increasingly being used by lawyers and by the judiciary for research and analysis, for drafting, for reviewing, and it's beginning to be considered as part of sentencing as well. As the legal profession becomes more and more reliant on generative AI, there's a pressing need to address concerns of bias, to ensure equitable legal outcomes, and to ensure ethical integrity. There are a range of issues that AI itself generates that are transforming into legal issues. We should be thinking about data protection. We need to be thinking about how the legal framework is supporting the use of AI. And in the context of all of this, it's important to continue thinking about how the law touches our lives. AI is being used in transactions where billion-dollar companies are purchasing other massive global enterprises, but it's also becoming part of the system that is being used when people buy their first houses. AI is being used in Supreme Court challenges on points of law that affect the rights of millions of people, and it's also being used as part of the system that looks at divorce courts and family courts that might affect the family that lives next door to you. AI is being used as lawyers are defending human rights defenders. It's being used in the International Criminal Court. And it's also being used as part of the system where shoplifters are being prosecuted in a local magistrate's court. It's being used on huge legal matters that are a million miles away from individuals. And it's also being used on matters that affect me or you or your families. And AI is touching all of these issues, and this is the context that we need to be thinking about AI and the law in, is that it touches so many things, the law touches so many things in our lives. It's important that we're able to ensure accuracy, procedural fairness. We need to be thinking about whether AI is democratizing access to law, or it's creating new barriers. My name is Nick Gleischer. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and we've got an amazing panel here to look at some of these issues. As I say, it's a huge topic. We will be scratching the surface only, but we definitely will be scratching the surface. So my panelists here, we've got Simon Levine, who's International Managing Partner and Global Co-CEO at DLA Piper. We have Laura Safdie, who's Vice President, Artificial Intelligence and Global Affairs Lead at Thomson Reuters. We have Bridget Andery, who's the Senior Policy Analyst at Access Now, and Judge Scott Schlegel, Appellate Court Judge, Louisiana Fifth Court Circuit of Appeal. There's loads that we're going to talk about, and we're going to get stuck right in. We will try and save some time as well for Q&A as we go through this conversation too. So I want to help paint the picture for how AI is being used in the legal context, and I'm going to come to you first, Simon. How is AI being used? How are you seeing it being used in the legal profession when it comes to law firms? And what's the response that you're seeing lawyers have to the use of AI?
Okay, so that's a good question, pretty broad. So look, I think the first thing is I sort of probably represent the larger commercial law firms in the world, and we are all collectively, and it's true of DLA Piper, are using AI quite a lot, but it's still in a formative stage. So yes, we're using AI to do more routine tasks we are increasingly using. We use Copilot, there's Co-Counsel, there's Harvey, there's all those other things that go on, and we're trialing them. Like a lot of law firms, we have developed our own internal AI system called Butterfly. It ends in an AI. If you've never noticed, people involved in AI think it's hysterically funny to come up with names with an AI in it. But anyway, ours is called Butterfly. And so that's great, right? We're doing that. It is, you talked about scratching the surface of talking about this topic. We are scratching the surface. At the moment, some of these things are faster, quicker, cheaper. Broadly, people are embracing it. If you've been in this industry as long as I have, I can remember having to stay up all night proofread, or if you were doing real estate transactions, having to colour in plans. In fact, so much so that one of my colleagues pretended to be colourblind just so he never had to do that job. But the reality is, I never complained when, documents were able to proofread themselves effectively, and our junior lawyers are not complaining about that. I think the challenge is, what does it mean for the profession going forward? How do we do it ethically? How do we interact with clients? How do we together work, and I'm sure we'll explore this, with regulators to ensure that we're doing this in the right way? But generally speaking, people are very enthusiastic about it, as am I think they should be.
Great. Judge Schlegel, I want to come to you next. You represent a slightly different perspective coming from the judiciary, but what are the primary ways that you're seeing AI as transforming or integrating into the processes in the judiciary? And I guess as an extension of that question, what are the opportunities that you see coming from that and the challenges? So just again, a small...
Yeah, again, very narrow question.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. The first time the courts learned about GenAI was just last year when the famous lawyer filed his brief and his pleading without site checking anything, just let's use ChatGPT, which, by the way, is not a legal tool. And we first heard the word hallucination, and that's really when the courts learned about this whole ChatGPT thing. And what did the courts do? Overreacted. We went ahead and said, you may not use AI. Oh, what? There's GenAI? What's the difference? And so we have these overbroad orders, and thankfully, folks are coming back and saying, all right, well, look, there's some good in this. Maybe we should let this go. So the courts have to figure out how we're going to deal with how the lawyers and litigants are using artificial intelligence, and specifically GenAI, and how we're going to manage that. Y'all remember the cat lawyer, right? I mean, this is the most confident lawyer I've ever seen in my life. He's like, Judge, I know I'm a cat, but I got this, let's go. Did we stop using Zoom at that point? No, we learned how to use it, and we're going to do the same thing. We've been here before, we're going to get through it. But specifically, what scares the heck out of me as a former domestic violence prosecutor and as a former trial court judge are the deep fakes. I mean, that's really what concerns me the most. And look, you can tell video. Video's not good enough, but audio is really, really scary. Nick left me a message. By the way, Nick, I own you now because I can clone your voice and do what I need to do. But think about this from a state court perspective. Anybody can walk into court, apply for a protective order. I can clone your voice. I can threaten myself, drop it on your voicemail, and I've got a protective order. Your guns are mine, the house is mine, the kids are mine. Oh, but, well, you can go to the hearing and have it, but who are the experts in this area? Vast majority of civil matters are non-represented, at least one side of it. So that's the scary side of it, and we can do that going on and on. But there are a lot of positives as well. You'll hear from everybody talking about from an access to justice perspective. This is going to open a lot of information and wherewithal for folks that cannot afford representation to be able to use these tools to kind of manage the courts. And the courts will be able to use these tools. You heard about the chatbots. Courts are going to be able, and they're starting to build chatbots to help walk people through the system. Just the process. Forget about the UPL discussion and argument. Just the process of how do I walk through the justice system. Those are a few things, positives and negatives. And again, thanks for the narrow question.
Thanks. And we're going to drill a bit deeper into these issues as we go through the conversation. Laura, I want to come to you next. So Thomson Reuters is developing legal AI products that are then being used excuse me, by members of the legal sector. How are you seeing the legal sector engage excuse me, in this technology from your perspective? And what's the reception to and uptake of these tools?
Yeah, it's a super exciting moment in the legal profession and the legal industry. I think now that we're almost 2 years on to the word generative AI kind of coming on the landscape within legal, there's now really a broad recognition that generative AI is going to materially change how we think about the practice of law and what a lawyer does on a day-to-day basis. Because for the first time ever in the history of any of our careers or lives, you can actually delegate substantive legal tasks to an AI-enabled tool and expect those tasks to be done competently, safely, securely, and accurately. And so that's triggering a lot of really important and challenging strategic questions across the whole industry. So what does this mean for the relationship between law firms and their clients? What does it mean for the business of a law firm and how we bill for our value? What does it mean for issues like access to justice, and how can we leverage this technology for good? All of those conversations are happening now. I will say that there are members of the legal profession and law firms and in-house legal departments that are really leading in these spaces, so leading in these conversations and also leading on rolling out this technology. And we can speak a bit more about what we've seen that looks like a really successful rollout when you have a very clear-eyed vision for how we want to leverage this technology, an understanding that AI is not a monolith and we have to assess the opportunities and the risks specific to the use case. But it's been an incredibly vibrant moment, and I think in general we're seeing across law firms, in-house legal departments, government agencies, civil society, a recognition that this technology is here to stay, and if we want to win in a future where the legal profession is enabled by AI, we have to start learning now. We have to start developing the skills and understandings to appropriately deploy AI for good in a safe and accurate way.
So I see this as really interesting. Like, it's clear that there's loads of applications within law firms. I think all of us are actually either current or former lawyers on the stage, and I know that law firms often don't adapt really quickly to new technologies, but it's interesting that it has happened. The process has already begun. It's the same with the court system. I'd really like to hear from you now, Bridget, and start thinking about how, beyond the kind of the function of the law, like how you're seeing AI being used to either bolster human rights defense work and thinking about issues around human rights, and how. Do you have examples of how you've seen AI being deployed and kind of the use cases for it?
Yeah, and interestingly, I think we've all had a quick conversation right before this, where we've kind of acknowledged that a lot of us will approach AI and systems being deployed from a really skeptical point of view. And there's a reason for this, obviously, historical injustices. But there is an opportunity, of course, and we cannot ignore that. For instance, Amnesty has used AI systems to map destruction and loss of life in war, and something like Give Directly, which helps people actualize their ECOSOC rights, has used AI as a decision-making system. But at the same time, something that we should acknowledge is that in as much as these charitable organizations, human rights organizations are using AI to ensure that there's access to justice, equitability, realization of human rights, they're also acknowledging at the same time that there are shortfalls. There isn't enough data in certain cases. They're acknowledging that there are margins of error, and so they are saying at the same time, in as much as we're using this, and this can be used for this particular purpose, there is reason for us to pause. There is reason for us to ensure that we're not using this as the entirety of the truth, right? There's a reason enough for us to have human intervention. There's a reason for this human touch. For instance, with the Give Directly example I've just given, where they basically use automated decision-making models to give money to people who are, at the margins, they don't have enough data. And the data that they use is SIM card data, satellite mapping, right? And this is based on who has a SIM card, for instance. If I do not have a SIM card, what does that mean for me and my family? Does it mean that I don't receive this aid? At the same time, this opens up a whole other discussion, which is something that I really enjoy working on digital identification. There's a wave of SIM registration in the continent right now. I work primarily in Africa. And when you think about SIM registration, you have to have an identity card. And a lot of countries are now going towards digital identification. This is an area where there's historically been a lot of discrimination, people being left out, people being left behind because of different reasons, whether it's biometrics, whether it's statelessness. And so when you start thinking about an initiative like this that then relies on this particular document that some people might not have, then it again means that in trying to democratize this access, or in trying to give people access to their ECOSOC rights or access to their human rights that are guaranteed to them in the Constitution, at the same time you're leaving out people who've been historically left out. So this is something that we still need to grapple with at the end of the day, that in as much as there are opportunities here, there are still margins of error. There's a lack of data in some cases, of course, and you could end up still leaving people out, and that's definitely something that has to be considered.
This is where we start, I think, getting into some of the complexity that we're talking about here. I think that, I hope everybody understands that there is an issue of access to the use of AI tools. So there are tools that are being sold at a premium that organizations that have deep pockets can pay to access. There are lots of tools that are available for others to use that will not have a premium cost to it. There is broad access as long as you have the tools to access them. Now, this does mean that there are some technical differences that people may be able to get a slightly higher quality of service. But there is still a whole swathe of people that may be entirely excluded because they don't have the basic equipment to be able to access it. And this idea of smartphones being a gateway to being able to use any of these tools is really important, because it means that if you are in a market where you don't have smartphones, or the connectivity is such that it's quite difficult to access, this becomes a potential barrier. And this is something that we all need to bear in mind as we're going forward. Bridget, I want to stick with you. So you spoke about issues with data, and I actually want to go a bit further about thinking about how this then bleeds into issues around data rights. So thinking about the underlying data that is being used as part of the LLMs that have these tools are being built on the top of, like, what are the challenges and again the opportunities that you see with the use of AI as we think about it from a data rights and more broadly from a human rights perspective? So thinking a bit more about the underlying data.
Yeah, and I think again, and everybody has mentioned here at some point just where this tech is being developed, where it is being deployed, the data that is using, and one thing that we need to also come to terms with is the fact that the data is just not enough in a lot of cases. Whether this means it's because it's been trained on a specific subset of data, whether this means we're starting to have conversation about data scrapping, what are the ideals around consent, what are the ideals around jurisdictional or jurisprudential ideas around data and the laws that exist in these countries. And so when we think about the data that these systems are trained on, for instance, and the fact that they are not diverse enough, the fact that they're from specific subsets of people, they lack context, then it means that we're transferring some of the issues that we already have there. When we think about how data is shared as well, third-party rights and things like that, we've had conversations and examples from countries where authorities and data controllers have handed over people's data without their consent and without their knowledge. Not because there are no laws, there are laws, but because people just don't know what's going on. There's no transparency, there's no accountability. And so when you also think about the individual rights of people who are especially not necessarily in the global minority, and most of these people in the global majority where their rights are constantly being diverted, it's a little bit, it's concerning that people don't have access to their rights at the end of the day, whether or not they're codified, because again, we must acknowledge that not all data rights are codified in all countries where this data is coming from. So whether this is from a scrapping point of view or someone simply handing over the data, and this doesn't only apply to private organizations, it also applies to authorities that have the power to actually collect this data and hand it over without my knowledge, without my consent. So data rights are being flouted every other day. And so this, it's a little bit of a strange balance where there are some people who have rights that are being completely flouted by authorities, by private organizations, and there are people who simply don't have access to these rights. And at the end of the day, their data is being used to better these systems. So it becomes a little bit of a conversation on whether people actually have access to these rights.
So thinking about, I mean, we've been tasked with talking about this massive issue, the law, and obviously every country on earth has laws. And so this idea of different contexts, different frameworks, the way that laws are being used, different laws covering different issues, and then thinking about the application being quite different depending on how strong the rule of law is in a particular country. All of this then again affects like people's access to these tools, people's ability to use these tools, and that layers on top of what we've been speaking about before. Thinking about that, and with that in mind, Laura, I'd like to come back to you. I referenced that at the moment, a number of the AI tools that are out there are expensive, like they are premium products. These are tools that are still being developed. We still have hallucinations that are happening, though it's quite likely, I assume, that those will disappear. I'm no technology expert, but we're still at the beginning of a technology. But like, what's your view on to what extent AI is reinforcing structural imbalances or acting as a leveler? Like, what are you seeing from your perspective? And can you kind of take us a bit further down that journey, thinking about the impact that it's having on structural imbalances in society?
Right. So of course the lawyerly answer to that is it depends. It depends on the context,
Excellent.
right? So in much the same way we saw with the internet, 20 years ago, the internet democratized access to information in really important ways. That doesn't mean that there weren't really important inequities that were elevated through that process, right? If you have an access to a computer to get access to the internet. We have a similar dynamic at play here. And so I think there are important kind of global questions about how to democratize access to this technology. But the use of this technology itself has incredibly important democratization opportunities across kind of every facet of society. And so we saw a few examples earlier in healthcare and in agriculture. The space I work in is in law. And the most, to me, one of the most exciting opportunities is finally having a tool that might reasonably be expected to make meaningful inroads against the justice gap, which is something that is obviously a global issue, but coming from the perspective of the US, more than 90% of civil legal needs go unrepresented by counsel in a justice system where you absolutely need counsel to get a real fair shake. And so the counterfactual of using AI is not like we have a truly well-functioning system that's accessible to all. So we have to come from that context, understanding the limitations that we're living in today and how incredibly important that is far beyond the numbers, right? Like for a normal person, the impact of the legal system is, do I have access to housing? Do I have access to medical care? Do I have access to federal benefits? Are myself and my family safe? And so the work that we've been doing is how do we expand access to these tools, which are extremely empowering, to the lawyers that serve communities in need. And so in the US, that's legal aid and legal services, nonprofit organizations that provide either free or highly subsidized legal services to communities in need. And so we've taken this opportunity from really the beginning of the advent of this technology, saying, okay, we understand that this technology can make legal work far more efficient and far faster, and who needs it more than communities in need of legal representation? So we've been working closely with legal aid organizations to really build use cases with them specifically. So not just AI, let's just say we're using AI, but really, where are your bottlenecks? What's preventing you from serving more people? What's making this take longer? And the most incredibly impactful use cases are coming out of that, even really early in the process. As you said, we're still quite early in this. Examples are, we're working with innocence organizations that do work to support the exoneration of people who are improperly sitting in prison, one of the greatest stains on the US justice system. And working with them just this month, I was told that they believe that every single habeas petition, every petition that they work on to try to get an innocent person out of jail, they are saving hundreds of hours by leveraging legal AI across the entire petition workflow. Everything from legal drafting, legal research, automatically assembling all of the papers, all informed by the very specific facts of that case, all done in a very secure way, all done very targeted towards the problem they're trying to solve, but ultimately allowing them to serve more people and serve them more quickly. And so I'm extremely optimistic by this opportunity, understanding, of course, we need to be really thoughtful about how we make those investments, but it does need to be a partnership between the people who are deep in the technology and the people who have the real expertise on the ground, whether it be specifically working with communities or working in specific areas of law.
Great, and you can see behind that we've got the Q&A. The Q&A thing has gone up, so please do use the app to be able to submit questions.
And Nick, if I could jump on off of that.
Do.
And as these tools provide more access to the justice system, the courts, as you imagine, are already overworked. You have, on any other Thursday, 100 criminal cases. You've got the civil matters that you have to handle. You have the custody matters you have to handle. You've got the civil litigation that you have to handle. And so as these access to justice is increased, the caseloads on the courts are going to increase. And here's how I see AI as assisting as well with that gap. Layering AI on top of these case management systems that help us to actually calendar and do smart calendaring and enabling us to say, all right, well, maybe I can handle 10 motions for summary judgment and 3 custody matters on this day and this time, and providing us actual, instead of guesswork and making people sit in court for 3, 4, 5 hours at a day, actually using the AI tools to layer on our case management systems. Maybe when we get these tools, again, they're very expensive now and it's very difficult to implement them in chambers, but assuming we are able to implement these GenAI tools in chambers, we too can use these tools to summarize documents, to give us essentially act as an additional law clerk, help us to review these documents, because not every judge has a law clerk. And if you're on the bench and you don't have a law clerk, how do you get ready for the next hearing or the next matter? And so being able to implement and utilize these GenAI tools to review the documents, and then you get into the argument of drafting opinions, and that's a great debate within the justice system and within the in-chambers debate. If you all saw Judge Newsom out of the U.S. 11th Circuit provided a 30-page concurrence. It did not have any bearing on the case, but he asked his clerk, hey, ask ChatGPT what the general understanding of landscaping is in a case. That was the question. What is the ordinary meaning of landscaping? Should a judge be asking ChatGPT what the ordinary meaning of landscaping as it relates to an insurance policy? Judge Newsom followed up with an opinion in the criminal matter a few months later saying it was an armed robbery, criminal defendant for sentencing, and the question was posed, what does physical restraining mean as it relates to the sentencing guidelines? Because the defendant did not actually put his hands on the clerk, but restrained the clerk with a firearm. Is that physically restrained? So the question that we have to ask in chambers is, at what point are we going over to the bot overlords taking over judicial decision-making process as opposed to using GenAI to enable us or help us and assist us with the judicial decision-making process? And that is the great debate that we're having now, assuming we can afford these tools.
Can I react one small point on that? Because we're also working, as you know, with the judiciary, and I think the way that we've been thinking about this is, AI use cases are not a monolith. We really have to split up the instances where we're leveraging AI to elevate information on which humans consume and then make decisions versus supplanting our decision-making with AI. And the latter is exceptionally risky, has very different risk implications than simply elevating information. Now, there are still extremely important accuracy considerations, making sure you're using the right tool for purpose. However, it is a very different situation to say we are going to automate bench memos from the litigation record than we are going to automate the judge, him or herself, which we obviously don't advocate for now. And then on price, the last thing is this technology, like most technologies, is rapidly becoming more affordable in terms of the underlying large language model bandwidth. And so I'm confident that over time, those cost dynamics will evolve.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I was just trying to absorb that. There's quite a lot there. Thinking about the court system then, so the AI potentially can be quite transformative when we're thinking about the mechanics of the court. Like how does the court actually operate? And that idea of having an AI tool making your calendar more efficient ought to be quite simple. I've got no idea how you do these things, but that ought to be realistically quite simple. And there is definitely an efficiency play there. That makes quite a lot of sense. You touched on challenges around the ethics of it, though. Like, how do we ensure judicial fairness? That's probably not the right framing. But how do you think about that? Like, I appreciate that's quite a big conversation, and I'm not asking for an official position from the US judicial system, but like, how do you think about that dynamic between on the in-chambers use, thinking about the benefits of efficiency versus the risks that you have around ethics? And like, if you zoom out, do you see a really, really transformative change in the judicial system from the use of AI? Like, what does this mean for juries in the future if actually you're able to ask not a chatbot, but an LLM what landscaping means rather than needing to ask a jury? Like, I'd really be really interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, from the judicial decision making, Laura and I had a great conversation in the back, and we'll continue to have that conversation. But who's elevating the information to the judge? So let's assume that I take the pleadings. I hope no one is suggesting drop the pleadings of lawyers into the chatbot, have it draft the opinion, and go, oh, that's pretty good. Let's go ahead with that and sign it. I hope nobody is suggesting that, although there are mediators and arbitrators before the justice system that are building tools for that use case. But, okay, so I use this tool and I say, please summarize the main arguments of counsel. Who's elevating that? And if I'm a overworked judge who then becomes kind of a Luddite, but I'm starting to use these tools, am I over-relying upon the elevation of certain information? And I don't want to call it lazy, but relying upon the tool as opposed to, I read everything, I reviewed everything, I've considered everything, I've reviewed the entirety of the record, and now I'm using the LLM as a clerk because I don't have time to draft that first opinion, but as I would do with my law clerk, here are the salient issues, here are the facts, here is the answer, here's what I need you to do, and here's the framework, provide me with a first draft. I think that is a much easier argument, and I've done this not formally, but in experiments. And when I've done it that way, what I've also learned is it wasn't my voice. Yes, it got the answer right, but I think a lot about the justice system and opinions from the court. Really, the voice does matter. If I say something one way, you could feel the justice system completely different. Even if the answer is right, you might feel that was not just. And is the public ready for this? Today, I don't think so from the court's perspective. If I'm making a custody decision and I say those 3 minor children are going with dad and not mom, and mom finds out that I used Grok and I should have used Gemini, is that justice? Is that person who I took the children from going to say, God, I wish to use Gemini? I think that it matters to the justice system and to the public perception and trust. We're at the trust conference. I think it matters that you can say Judge Schlegel is the worst judge that ever existed in the entire world. I cannot wait for his re-election because I'm going to go after him and I'm going to take him out. That makes you feel good. It's just like, we're here in England and Wimbledon's getting rid of the line judges after 175 years and going to the ELC, the electronic line call. I mean, if I'm a tennis player, I want to yell at that line judge. I want to feel it. So, I'm a big fan of GenAI and artificial intelligence, but I don't want to lose what the justice system is. I don't want to lose the nuance. I don't want to lose the humanity. And I guess that's my quick take.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a view on. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to technology companies in the context of law. And by the way, Laura, I did notice the price is coming down, which is great. So thank you for that.
We're working on it.
Yeah. But actually, I also know a bunch of people that would say you might get a fairer justice system if a bunch of AI tools were deciding the cases, right? I mean, I litigated before I was running the law firm for 20 odd years, and I got some really, really bad judgments that ended up being overturned, but cost everyone a lot of money. Now that's, we become friends in the green room, so I don't want to mess that friendship up.
I would have gotten it right.
But
don't worry.
yeah, I'm sure you would have done. But the fact of the matter is, there are two ways of looking at this, and as people accept judges with their own backgrounds, their prejudices, their whatever, and I'm in the system where you don't re-elect judges. They get appointed and then they're appointed until they fall over or give up or go watch Wimbledon or whatever they do. Sorry to all my judge friends out there, but the reality of the situation is that I know plenty of people that say they could get a fairer system. So I sort of agree with you, but I don't want to dismiss AI completely from that more than you are.
I think it would be really helpful to start thinking about the protections that we need to put in place or encourage the sector, the ecosystem, into putting in place. Bridget, actually, maybe I'll come to you first, thinking about that. We've spoken a bit about the different contexts that AI is being applied in and how that actually changes the way that people are on the receiving end of the AI tools that are there. That's probably not the right phrasing, but you get the gist. But what protections do you think should be applied to try to ensure that the data that is fed into the AI technologies does what it needs to, that it goes further to try to ensure equity and equitable use?
First of all, I think, we need to acknowledge what the problem is. And I'm even listening just to Scott and to Simon, for instance, talking about what that would look like for an algorithm to sort of help in decision making. And of course, you've acknowledged that we're not feeding in pleadings into a system and saying, okay, give me a decision. But there's something to be said about bias, first of all, right? And this is one of the biggest problems that we have when it comes to this access and negotiating what access looks like, and especially for certain people who've been historically marginalized. And the thing about bias and the thing about these models is that they're trained on data that comes from people. The people in this room have their own biases. The people on this panel have their own biases. And so it's just transferred, right? You transfer the bias, whether it's against people who look a certain way, whether it's people who come from a specific background on, social class, race, gender, all these things, they get fed into the same kind of data sets that then inform what decisions are made, whether it's automated decision making or an opinion, right? There's the hallucinations that have been mentioned as well. And in the worst cases, bias means genocide, right? And that's something that we have to acknowledge, that in as much as we don't really see it happening a lot, something like gospel and lavender that is being used by Israel is the highest form of predictive policing, for instance, which for them is justice, right? It's eradicating someone that would cause death to people, but at the same time targeting the wrong people, because again, the data sets that have been fed are deeply flawed, right? So if something like lavender, which targets people specifically, gospel of course targets buildings, but lavender targets people, and this means that anyone who is seen as Hamas operative is then bombed in their house. But the data set that was fed into that AI is deeply, deeply flawed. And so how do we mitigate some of these issues? Because I don't think it's completely possible to eradicate, especially when deploying at such a massive level or such a large scale. It's impossible to eradicate all of the risk, but how do we mitigate the risk? Of course, there are many laws that exist in different jurisdictions, and those laws have their own protections. Again, I've mentioned before that some of these laws are just not paid attention to. People don't go by the law, and this is, of course, deeply rooted in some horrible ideas about what people think about laws that exist perhaps in a global majority, because we've seen many, many times even just private companies, private organizations parachuting into the global majority, deploying things without following the law. So is there a standard that we can arrive at, and how do we arrive at this standard? And one great thing that we could implement are impact assessments, whether these are algorithmic impact assessments, data protection impact assessments, and most of all, human rights impact assessments. With algorithmic impact assessments, of course, this is still an emerging area. The standards are still being set. With data protection impact assessment, sometimes there is an issue there because there's lack of mandate for it to be made public, for that transparency, accountability, for them to release it to the general public. With human rights impact assessments, this is ideally the most holistic way to look at some of these risks. And these impact assessments are not only supposed to be done, in my opinion, at the beginning or before deployment. They should be, ex post and ex ante, meaning, yes, we've done it before we've deployed the technology, but at the same time, we come back to it. We make sure that as it's ongoing, any new risk is identified and the mitigation is also identified. And with this also comes transparency. Like, it doesn't mean that once I've done the impact assessment, I get to sit with it and decide what I release. It must be released to the public. And it should not be done entirely in-house. There should be independent oversight over certain impact assessments, especially when it comes to technologies that are going to be used on a large scale. Technologies that are going to be used for public service delivery, technologies that are going to affect people's everyday lives. There should be impact assessments, and the standards have to be set at a governance level so that there's a minimum standard for them to achieve before we are able to say that this is a successful or this is a effective impact assessment. Those standards have to be set, and they have to be set by multi-stakeholder approach, not just industry players sitting down somewhere and saying this is the standard, and they can set a really low standard for themselves. So at a governance level, the standards must be set, and then there has to be transparency around these things and accountability as well, that if you did put up this impact assessment and say this is the mitigation that you're going to employ, you have to be held to account. Have you deployed that mitigation? Have you come back and said that the risk is now taken care of by another assessment to say that, yes, this is the risk that we identified, this is the mitigation that we deployed, this is how it has worked. If it hasn't worked, have you gone back and taken a closer look and decided what other mitigation can be put in place? And then, of course, we have to get to a point where we say then that if something goes beyond a certain risk, then it should not be deployed. So kind of
this comes
figuring
back to
out
some
those
of the
levels.
topics that were being discussed yesterday as well. It's that idea of it's all well and good to have frameworks in place, but unless there is the accountability that goes alongside it, they're kind of redundant. And it's interesting that you're picking it up in this context as well. Simon, what do you think the legal profession should be doing? So that's thinking about the framework, the governance that we need to put around particularly the data that is being used. But in terms of the legal profession, what do you think lawyers, the profession at large, should be doing to try to ensure safe and fair use of AI?
Well, look, I mean, you can see from just listening to this debate that AI itself is a tool. It doesn't deal with the underlying issues. Bridget mentioned some things in there. There'll be people in this room, me and Tali will have different views on what's going on in the world at the moment, and people will use AI technology to make their own arguments. And that's not going to change anything in how humans react as to what is right and wrong and what is a terrorist or not or anything else. Law can only regulate in a certain way, but law regulates in a way you can't avoid the whole government point, and lawyers often have to, along with judges, have to interpret that law. There's a law in Russia, there's a law in the US. They're both laws. You can have a debate about what's right or wrong. Now, how do law firms and the law deal with that? Well, so far around the world, it's dealt with it pretty badly over the years, frankly. AI is not a tipping point, but is just another example. The previous example before that was, I used to be a media lawyer, was the regulation of social media. And both law firms and regulators and governments and industry players have all done a pretty poor job of regulating social media, which is actually part of the issue you get with AI when you have open and closed systems. And I was at a meeting, maybe one or two other people were here, not, but with the global CEO of Microsoft, who was in town on Monday. And if you ask Microsoft, I'm sure some won't mind me saying this, they're still working on how they deal with the issues of bias and ethics and all those other things you said, because it's constantly learning and it will get better over time. We discussed that. So what can law firms do? Well, firstly, I think law firms have got to be alive to it. I've long believed that law firms, particularly the biggest law firms in the world, need to work more effectively together. Most of the time they spend their time arguing with each other in the legal press about who's better than the other, and I think in many industries, there is the examples of people working better together, for sure. I think on top of that, I think we have to work more closely with the technologists and the regulators and the governments. And at the moment, they're all working separately. They sort of say they're working together, but in truth, I actually think they need to work better together. You will never eradicate the problem of bias or people's views, but I think if you can, if you look in my world of intellectual property, through WIPO and the international conventions, there was a pretty good job done of how you regulate intellectual property around the world, and there's no reason not to do that with artificial intelligence, but you do need the players to come together, including law firms.
Yeah, I think, again, this has been a recurring theme over the day and a half that we've had so far at the conference, that actually what is required is ecosystem-level collaboration between different actors, different agents within the space, coming together to align, to coalesce around some of the governance structures that we need to put in place. We've got 10 minutes or so left, and I'm just looking at the questions that are flooding in. It's very exciting. We've actually there's been quite a few questions that are touching on quite similar themes here, thinking about actually what AI looks like in terms of job replacement in the legal sector. So there's been a question here about AI replacing the role that might otherwise be given to law clerks. There's been questions here as well about how we ensure that legal professionals are upskilled in the right way. I mean, obviously, this is a whole new way of operating that people need to be thinking about, and all of these things are going to have effects that ripple across the sector. I don't know which of you would like to start with.
I'll probably say something about how we look at it from a law firm, or we look at it from a DLA Piper perspective. I mean, I'm incredibly positive about AI, and I think it's a massive opportunity. And I think in a profession that is fundamentally reactionary, we should be looking at this as an exciting opportunity of lawyers working with technologists and technology businesses, not doing the usual legal thing of running for cover when anything change comes up. Law, in the 30-odd years I've been in law, ways of working, technology, regulation has changed the way in which people have worked, and it's not been a bad thing. I do think law firms will have to ultimately look at their structures, though, because we won't stop taking on junior lawyers or paralegals, and I suspect it will be true of law clerks too. But we will have to start thinking as we deliver using AI in a different way. If you start using a technology platform to deliver advice using a SaaS-type model, which is something that is perfectly possible, could be happening with law over the next few years, then you've got to rethink about how you judge your lawyers. It's not necessarily about chargeable hours. It's not necessarily just about billing numbers. There are other ways in which you have to view and reward what is a good job. So I do think the business of law is going to have to change the way it approaches things, but I do think AI is very positive for the legal industry.
Okay. Do you want to?
Sure. I've been involved in over 100 deployments of AI legal assistant at law firms and in-house legal departments, and in no case did any of the leadership of those organizations say, we'd like to deploy this AI legal assistant and now cut 10% of our lawyers or 20% of our lawyers. I think the best version of this, of experimentation and beginning to leverage this technology is, let's use it and see how we can create value for our clients today. And then as we develop more knowledge, as we develop our AI skill set about what use cases are really effective, which use cases are too early or too risky, then we're in a better position to assess, okay, what proportion and what types of tasks are going to be delegated to AI more than to humans, and what role do our professionals on our team need to play in how we deploy them? So we've talked in a few different contexts about how do we keep the professional in the loop. In no case have I talked to a senior lawyer that says, I'm going to replace my team and just have AI write my brief and file it for me. However, we have a lot of examples of, here are all the inputs in the record. I want AI to do the first pass on establishing what are the red flags from the record, asking complex questions against our voluminous record, right? And it wasn't the case in the past where, we got e-discovery software and suddenly discovery wasn't a really important or expensive part of practicing law, right? It's that it's evolved. It's that the complexity and scale of the data we're dealing with is massive, and so AI can help us increasingly and in increasingly complex ways. And so I think we're all on a journey in the industry and in the profession about how are we best going to use it and what does it mean for our staffing. The other piece of this, which you've probably dealt with more than me, is attorney development. How do we ensure that when we're taking away a lot of the frankly, grunt work that many of us didn't go to law school aspiring to do, but that is an important part of how lawyers become skilled in their practice. How do we replace that with apprenticeship or secondment, where they can develop these higher level skills that clients will expect from the lawyers of the future?
I think we'll come to Judge Schlegel next, and then Bridget.
Yeah, let's take this a step further. We have a very, very increasing shortage of court reporters and interpreters. And how do we not replace? If we know that court reporters, we have a shortage, and we know that we're not training, and we know that AI is getting better and better and better at transcribing, I always like to say and use the example of, what did the judge say? 2 lawyers come into my courtroom, I rule on it and say, within 5 business days, prepare a judgment for the court. The lawyers walk out, look at each other and go, what did the judge say? And then they fight and argue over what the judge said, and then they provide competing orders to the court, and we waste our time dealing with that. Why, when you leave the courtroom, do you not receive an automatic email with a rough draft transcription with a GenAI produced judgment of what I just said? The lawyers can look at it and go, yep, yep, yep. I don't need to order a transcript. I don't need to waste my time or money. I don't need to call my clients. I can just say, hey, look, here's what the judge said. We call each other. We go ahead and sign it or revise the judgment and submit it. Why are we not doing things like that we could do today with the technology of today? Again, if you want to take the judgment up, order the transcript, go forward. But there are a lot of times that courts can't even hold court because they lack a court reporter or an interpreter. There are many times that we cannot find an interpreter for a certain thing. And I'm not talking about the huge, during trial, but a continuance. Hey, your lawyer's not here. We can't match them with the public defender and the prosecutor. We just need you to come back in 3 or 4 days. Here's your new notice. I mean, there are low-hanging fruit that we don't have to get all this, exciting GenAI where it's drafting opinions for us, but there's so much low-hanging fruit in the justice system that we can layer AI and GenAI on top of to make the system more efficient, more effective, and more accessible today for not many dollars.
And there's a little more context to this, of course, because I was actually just saying to someone right before this that in Kenyan courts, we write notes by hand, and there's no mandated court reporter. Like, if you're in a hearing, the judge is writing notes as you speak. And sometimes, we have this whole program where we go in and students help every now and then, but primarily it's the judicial officers that will write these notes for themselves, and then you can have it typed later. And so I think we have a long ways to go before human beings are starting to get replaced, because again, there's a linguistic gap there. And I was also saying that sometimes you have to have an interpreter in court. Sometimes people will mix languages when they're speaking in court, and you kind of have to translate it on the go as you write. So if then there are these systems that transcribe for you or whatever it is, it doesn't work in certain contexts. That's definitely what I would say. It will not work in certain contexts. So with that in mind, we're really, really, really longer than we think, really long way to go before we even think of replacing the human.
And I think that there's another point in there as well, is that particularly people that don't regularly engage with legal processes and the legal system, that human is a really important component. There's that social component to it. I think people, by and large, will have a lot more faith in a human guiding them through a process than they may do with an app.
And you're right about that. One of the things it just reminded me we were talking about, and Bridget and I were talking about before, was I'd spend a lot of time, because involved with my pro bono team at the COPs, at the various Conference of the Parties meetings on carbonisation. And one of the things that really comes out of those, like did to me anyway, is just there are how many countries in the world going, it's fine to talk about decarbonisation, you bunch of 20 developed countries or whatever. We've got 200 years of catching up to do. And my worry, when we were talking about this, was that in AI and technology, that we don't create another divide between various types of countries. We're doing a lot of work at the moment, not just in Africa, but also in the Pacific Islands. And you can see in some parts of the world where they're going to be left behind in the AI space if we don't teach people how to use it and give them the ability to adopt it and use it for the good. So there's a big access to justice, but access to technology point where you do need human beings, and we do need to bring them in and train people and get them on board. So I do think there's a big issue here for society generally.
Yes, I agree with that. And if only we had more time to talk about it, quite frankly. We could have the whole day on this topic. We're not going to have more time to look at additional questions, but I'm very happy to volunteer my panelists' time through the rest of the day. Just grab them, ask very difficult questions to them. They're brilliant at answering these things on the fly. Just before we wrap up, one final word from each of you. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the use of AI in the legal sector? Just one word.
Optimistic.
Optimistic.
Pessimistic.
Optimistic.
I love that. A balance. I love that. We haven't had long enough today to do this topic justice at all. I hope that you've been able to gather through the conversation that we've had that actually there are so many different competing components here. The issue of access is a real issue. There are people that just will not be able to access the AI tools. And that may be because they don't have the smartphones that have the apps to it. It may be because the infrastructure is not there. But even for those that do have access to those tools, use then becomes a really important issue. How do we ensure that when you are able to access an AI-enhanced legal process, that the way that it is being used is being done so in a way that actually respects and enhances rights, that makes processes more effective, more efficient, and more inclusive? And this is going to be the big issue that we're going to have to deal with. We've spoken a huge amount about the ways that AI can be used to strengthen the mechanics of the legal system. And increasingly, it's going to be used to strengthen the content too, as long as we are able to ensure that a human stays in the loop. That we can use this, as I say, to enhance the way that we're using the law. This is going to be potentially an incredibly inclusive and leveling system that will ensure that more and more people have access to the tools that they need to, that more and more people can engage in legal processes with support. If we can, Laura used the stat that 90% of court processes are unrepresented at the moment. That's a huge and massive structural imbalance that we have in society. And through the course of this conversation, I've become more and more convinced that if we can get the collaboration right, if we can get the ecosystems to come together, provide the governance frameworks and structures around this, it will be the great leveler of our society going forward for the next generation. We have now run out of time, but I would like to say a massive thank you to the panelists. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for bringing your insights here. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day. Thanks very much.